and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's jump right in to study some Jewish history together. So we're picking up now just after the dark days of 1492, the expulsion of Sephardic Jewry from Spain, which just continued on to see the Jews being expelled from other places, like 4 years later in 1496 from Portugal. And we pick up in a time period where we ask the question and have to answer the question of where exactly do the Jews go at this point. Now we have Sephardic Jewry kicked out of the Iberian Peninsula. We already have Ashkenazi Jewry basically kicked out of Western Europe, out of France, England, and Germany. So where do the Jewish people find themselves now? And tonight we will discuss that the Jews will settle in Poland and slowly but surely start to trickle back to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. Now, this time period that we find ourselves in is known as the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance is essentially the time period where the Christian world emerges from the Dark Ages. During this whole time period, essentially from the fall of the Roman Empire until the 15th century, the 16th century, different people give different dates as the starting of the Renaissance, but the Christian world was knee-deep in the Dark Ages, and the bastion of culture, of education in the world was really the Muslim world at this time period. So as we see with the Renaissance, the Christian world, first in Western Europe, and then eventually somewhat in Eastern Europe, the Christian world will come out of the Dark Ages, and that time period is known as the Renaissance. Again, that's assuming that Eastern Europe has actually come out of the Dark Ages. Many would say Eastern Europe never came out of the Dark Ages, but we see in the Renaissance it's a time period where the church loses control. A lot of this is after the wake of the failed Crusades, after the wake of the Black Death, where religion didn't do anybody a darn thing of help during the deaths of probably a third of the world, of half of Europe, and the church loses its grip, and we see that the Christian world once again becomes engaged in philosophy and culture and decadence, but there were tremendous advancements. It's in this time period where we meet people like Galileo, who forwards the idea that the Earth is round and the concept of gravity, and he was a committed Christian, so he actually had to recant at one point. He was one of the first people to say the Earth revolved around the sun. Now, it's interesting when we talk about these ideas that were considered so heretical by the church in the Renaissance, and we have these ideas in our Talmud. If you look in the Talmud Rosh Hashanah, again, it's a little hard to understand, but we're already dealing with the concept of a round Earth. We're already dealing with the concept of the Earth relative to the sun. And in general, scientific discovery is never a challenge for Judaism. It's one of the main differences between us and the Middle Age Christians is that everything that was a scientific invention, a scientific discovery, the church fought en masse and put down and excommunicated. We welcome these things, and as we've seen throughout the years, some of the greatest Torah scholars were also some of the greatest scientists, because it's interesting just that science has never disproven Judaism. It's only come to be more and more aligned with Jewish philosophy and Jewish thought, and we see a lot of ideas that are discovered and become basic scientific thought were originally written in the Talmud, were originally written in medieval works like the Rambam, and we are never, as Jews, we're never afraid of science. We're always open to the ideas of science and to the advancements of science, and that was not always the case for our Christian brethren, especially not in the Middle Ages, and especially not with the rise of the Renaissance. It was a very challenging time for the Christians, and we see that this takes the church by storm. The decadence of the time takes the church by storm, and so much so that we see for the first time you actually have clergy of the church that's not even so religious, that is more influenced by the Renaissance than it is by the church, and that obviously affects things in a major way within the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance, the main location, the famous location of the Renaissance is Italy, and Italy was one of the places where, at least in many parts of Italy, the Jews were allowed to settle after the Spanish expulsion, after the the expulsion of Spanish Jewry, of Sephardic Jewry, and the Jews really thrive in the Renaissance. We see that at this time Jews are one of the major professions is that Jews are doctors. So the concept of a nice Jewish doctor is not a new concept. As we said, the Rambam was a doctor. We see now in the 16th century we have a lot of Jewish doctors. And what's interesting is as scholarship starts to emerge again in the Christian world, Hebrew becomes very popular amongst the Christians. And a lot of Christian scholars want to learn Hebrew. They want to write in Hebrew. They study in Hebrew, and it is the Jews who become these teachers of Hebrew in the secular world, in the academic world. And it's interesting because at the same time period, we're already after Christopher Columbus at this time. We're just before the Pilgrims, but the Pilgrims were Puritans, and in many ways, those are the Puritans coming from England who will settle this country, who will settle America. And the Puritans were very into Hebrew, and that's why if you look at the emblems of some major universities, I know Yale University is one, I believe there's others, the emblem, because these were Puritan universities, the emblem has Hebrew in it. The Yale University I know says Ur V'Tam, I think was similar to Urim V'Tumim, that's in their shield. And not only that, but when the Pilgrims come to America, they actually, as they're building the new Christian world as they view it, they have a debate amongst themselves as to what their language should be. Should it be English, like what they spoke in England, or should it be none other than Hebrew? Right? You can imagine the situation in America if Hebrew had been selected as the native tongue of the Puritan community. It quite possibly would become the native tongue of America. But that didn't happen. They stuck to English. But when we talk about the Renaissance, really the most major development as far as the world is concerned in general, and the Jews specifically, is the advent of the printing press. Now, the printing press is actually invented, discovered somewhere around the year 1440, so towards the halfway point of the 15th century, by a German goldsmith by the name of Johann Gutenberg. And the very first printing press was known as the Gutenberg Printing Press, and the first book that he produced was the Gutenberg Bible, and he is the one who is credited with inventing the modern day movable type printing press, or modern at that time. It's obviously advanced much more since then with laser printing and everything we have now. But that started a printing revolution, and a revolution in and of itself in the world. Because before this point, or up until this point, if you wanted to disseminate ideas throughout the world, you had really just two options: written work, meaning handwritten work, or speeches, polemics, right? Getting up and delivering speeches, going town to town. And that's why we talk about so many of the great Jews before this point in history, that they were travelers. They would travel the Jewish world to have an influence. Or like the Rambam. The Rambam was a tremendous, a great corresponder. We have so many letters from the Cairo Geniza back and forth between the Rambam and myriads of people, because that's how you had your influence before the printing press. That was the only way to have an influence. With the advent of the printing press, now the written word becomes much cheaper to disseminate. Just to compare what the world was like before Gutenberg's printing press and what it was like after Gutenberg's printing press. To write a book by hand, you could write about 40 pages per day. That was about the maximum that a transcriber, that a copier, whatever they were called, could do handwriting copying. About 40 pages a day. The Gutenberg printing press could pour out 3,600 pages per day. So you can see how that tremendously changes the dissemination of information in the world. And we see that within just several decades, by the beginning of the 1500s, there are over 200 cities and a dozen European countries that will have a Gutenberg printing press. And by the year 1500, there will already be a total of 20 million volumes that will have been printed by Gutenberg's printing press. So from the year roughly 1440, when it's invented, 60 years later, you already have 20 million volumes that have been produced by the printing press. And that's also very challenging to the church, and very challenging to everybody, because we think about the different revolutions that have happened happened in modern times. We probably the next major revolution after the advent of the printing press would be the advent of the radio, and then after that, the advent of the TV, and then the internet, which we all know was discovered by Al Gore. I had to do an aside. I like to make that Al Gore joke, but even though he didn't really invent the internet, I believe his quote was, "I practically invented the internet," and he was the first person to champion the concept of the internet in the Senate. So he does deserve a lot of credit for it. He didn't invent it, but he deserves credit for really championing it and directing funding towards the research and the development of it. But we can think about these revolutions, and it's interesting the time periods that have crunched in between them, because we had the printing press in the 15th century. We have the radio, I think, the 19th century, I think. I'm not 100% sure. We have the TV in the 20th century, and then we have the internet in the late 20th century, and then we have Internet 2.0 with social media, when at that point anybody could so to speak put their information out there, and we just now have a world where it's very easy to disseminate ideas. Again, it's also very noisy. It's very hard to get attention because there's so many quote-unquote ideas being disseminated. But that revolution really begins with the Gutenberg printing press. It's the first time that we can, so to speak, en masse get ideas out to the world. And this will obviously have a major impact on the Jewish world, because just like the rest of the world, that same time period that it took to write of roughly 40 pages a day, well, that was for the Jews too. So when we had Jewish volumes, if you wanted to have copies of Jewish volumes, you needed to have someone write it who was writing at a rate of 40 pages per day. And like that, books don't get widely disseminated. And whereas today we have Jewish homes, like my home, Baruch Hashem, filled with Jewish books, and hopefully every Jewish home has at least some sort of a Jewish library. For a Jew to even own a book in these times was something, and even for a study hall to own a book or a full Talmud or any of these things was something remarkable. And when we talked about the tragedy of the burning of the Talmud and the works of the Balei Tosfos by Louis the Ninth in 1240, part of the reason that was such a tragedy is that was 200 years before the printing press. So to reproduce it, well, they had to go to communities that still had copies and copy them, and it was not simple. So it was just a whole new world for the whole world in general, and a whole new world for the Jewish world specifically. And we're going to see now the mass dissemination of Jewish works. Now, the Jews from day one become we're regularly referred to as the people of the book, and part of that is really because since time immemorial we've always been into education, into the study of Torah, into the study of Torah thought, and therefore when the printing press comes up, we're going to see that the Jews, I think from that point and on into modern times, are going to be the number one purchaser of books in the world. I mean, there's a reason when we talk about the New York Times bestseller list, because New York is a city where a lot of books are bought, and there's a lot of Jews there, and that's going to start very early on, because we're going to see a very interesting phenomenon go on in Europe with the development of the printing press, and that is that to be able to own a printing press, the church was trying their darndest to keep their hold on the world, so they made it that the church would issue licenses for the printing press. And a Jew, of course, cannot get a license. So if a Jew wanted to print a book, they had to work in cahoots with the non-Jews who had licenses. So this relationship develops quite quickly, because the non-Jew realizes how lucrative it is to print Jewish books, because while they didn't know Hebrew, but they'd hire Jews to be able to set out the Hebrew printing press and to be able to print Jewish books. And so the early producers of Jewish works are many of them are non-Jews, and we can also say that parenthetically that those books are often heavily censored by the Christian church. Sometimes they're even self-censored by the Jews. For example, we have if you look in your prayer book, in your siddur, in your art school siddur, whatever one you use, you'll see that Aleinu, in the first paragraph of Aleinu, there is a line that now we print in parentheses, but we had taken out altogether because we thought that, and rightfully so, it could be taken the wrong way or the right way, and therefore offensively to the Christian world. And that is the line of Shehemish Tachavim Lehelvarik, that they bow down to emptiness and to nothingness, and to a God that does not listen to them. You can understand how the Christians might not like that. So that was removed from many siddurim. Many people think we shouldn't put in siddurim nowadays, and I think that's why, even even the ones that it appears in, we put it in parentheses. But many Jewish works were censored, either self-censored by the Jews, or the books had to go through the censorship of the church before they could be published and sent out to the Jewish world. Now, for this reason, we have, for example, the Talmud. The Talmud altogether, as we know it, maybe has a handful of mentionings of Jesus throughout the whole entire Talmud, and none of them are positive. So needless to say, those were censored out. Now in modern times, have been put back in. And Maimonides also has a section where he talks about Jesus. Again, it's not so unfavorable, but definitely in his section, he makes it clear that Jesus was not the Messiah. And that was also taken out by the censors. So nowadays, we've been able to put these back together through manuscripts we found, either through the Cairo Geniza or other Genizas. But it's interesting that one of the reasons why our works were so censored in that time was because the church was in charge, Jews couldn't have a license, and therefore there was a Christian censor even on Jewish books. But it's just interesting that these early works, a lot of them were produced by the Christians. Now, two of the most famous names in Jewish printing at this time was a family named Cincino in Italy, who actually was able to get a license and was able to have their own printing house. And the first work that is published, the first Jewish work that was published was, so the first Jewish printing house is the Cincino Press. The modern day Cincino Press is just using the name. It's in no way connected to them. But the original Cincino Press was the first Jewish press. The first Jewish works that were produced were the Chumash with Rashi's commentary, or the Tur, that book, that work of Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher that we talked about, I think, last week. It's a debate of which one came out first, but those were the first two Jewish works that came out. But the Cincino family, that they put out their first work in 1483, and they work on the Talmud, and they are the first ones to produce the Talmud, to produce tractates of the Talmud. They actually produce upwards of 16 tractates, and the layout of the Talmud that we have, that we use until this very day, was created by the Cincino family. So if you think about how a page of Talmud looks, we'll put up on the screen here for everybody to look at, how you have in the middle, that's the actual text of the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the text of the Talmud. On the inside margin of every page of the Talmud, you have the Rashi commentary, and on the outside margin of every page of the Talmud, you have the Tosfos collected commentary, the collection of Tosfos that we have, and it's put on the outside. So this form, this is what we call the Tsuru Sadaf of the Talmud, was created by the Cincino family in 1483 and will exist until the Talmuds that are printed today. The Shas that we have today, the Talmuds printed today, we refer to as the Vilna Shas, because the Cincino, the Shas that's the Talmud that's published in Europe at this time will go through some updates, and the style that we use now is referred to as the Vilna Shas because it was printed in Vilna, Lithuania. Originally set, we should say, the setting of it was in Vilna, Lithuania, because the printing press, you of course need the setting by the plates, and then you put the paper through it with the ink to produce the books. So Cincino is the first family to produce the Talmud, but there's a non-Jew by the name of Daniel Baumberg in 1519 who's a non-Jew, and he is the first to produce a complete set of the Talmud. So the Cincinos did about a third of the Talmud, and Baumberg comes along to make the first Baumberg Talmud, which is the first complete set of the Talmud. Now, he takes the Cincinos' pagination. He takes their Tsuru Sadaf, their page layout, and uses the exact same thing. And needless to say, the Cincinos were not too happy about that. But what could they do? The Cincinos were Jewish, and Baumberg was a non-Jew, and the Cincinos, there's no way they could sue in court, and they could just really be upset about it. But be it as it may, the first complete Talmud was made by a non-Jew, Baumberg, but the layout, the Tsuru Sadaf, the pagination that we have, was created by the Cincino family in Italy. Now, the advent of the printing press also produces a number of halachic issues. For example, what is the status of sacred books that are put out by the printing press? Do they have the same status as like a Torah, mezuzah, tefillin, where when it comes time to dispose of them, they have to be buried in a geniza? Or do they have lesser sanctity? By the way, the halacha is they have lesser sanctity, but not that much less. Once it's a printed book, for sure, with God's name, it is put into a geniza. You're not just supposed to throw it out in the garbage. But that question came for the first time. What is the sanctity of these books being printed out? And not only that, but when we talk about real Sifrei Kodesh, like a Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzos, a get, for example, can those be produced by the printing press, or do they still have to be handwritten? That was never a discussion in halacha before you had the printing press. Now, obviously, we came out halachically that they had to be handwritten. A Sefer Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzos, one of the reasons they're also expensive is because they have to be handwritten by a sofer. A get, a bill of divorce, has to be written by a sofer. But the halacha is not even discussed before the printing press because, again, the Talmud discussed what they had to be written with. But, hypothetically, you can make a printing press that has the same items as part of it. But no, we came out in halacha, it has to be done by a man. It has to still be handwritten. And not only that, we had questions of copywriting. Halachically, and like the Cincinos tried to claim a copyright, but Jew unto Jew. And these questions started to come up in Jewish court, for the first time. If for example, if I write a book, and you go and you decide to print in your printing press without permission from me, without giving me royalties, did you steal it from me? Did you not steal it from me? All these halachic questions come up for the first time with the advent of the printing press. So it was a huge revolution that changed the world, remarkably, a watershed moment for the world. And nothing will change the world as much as the printing press until the radio comes along, and then the TV, and then the internet, and then the cell phone, etc., down the path of the dissemination of information. Okay, one thing that we see throughout Jewish history is that anytime there's a great tragedy, the result is messianic, at least at some level, some messianic fervor. Now part of that is first of all, in the Jewish psyche, we have this concept of the Milchamas Gog uMagog, talked about by our prophets, that before the redemption of the Jewish people, before we all return to the land of Israel, before the Messianic era, there's going to be a major war that unfortunately is going to be very bloody, and therefore anytime there's tremendous tragedies in the Jewish world, we approach those quite often as ikvasa de Mashiach, as the birth pangs of the Messianic era. And the expulsion and really the death of Sephardic Jewry at this time is no exception. And we're even going to see a number of figures who are going to appear on the scene and with a certain amount of messianic pretension. And two of the most famous we'll address now. One is a man by the name of David Haruvaini. Now, David Haruvaini was a man who claimed to come from the tribe of Reuven. Reuven was one of the 10 northern tribes, aka the 10 lost tribes, and he claimed, sort of in the mystical Kabbalistic idea, that the 10 tribes still exist intact behind a magical river called the Sambation River that spits out rocks 6 days a week and rests on the Shabbos. And he somehow got out of that community and was able to come to the rest of the world, and he claimed to be the brother of the king of this community that was behind the river Sambation. And he came to the Christian world. He comes to Portugal, and he actually gets an audience with the Pope at one point, and he's proposing that this big Jewish kingdom of the 10 lost tribes unite together with the Christian world to fight off the Muslims and to help reconquer the land of Israel, and then the Christians and the Jews can live harmoniously in the land of Israel. And like I said, he was dynamic and convincing enough to get audiences with big Christians, with big Christian names. Again, he claimed to be the minister of the War Department. He said his brother's name was King Joseph. He said he was from an area called Chabur, and he said there were 300,000 Jews in his kingdom, and some people were impressed. The King of Portugal was impressed. It seems that the Pope was somewhat impressed, and at a certain point, he's gaining some traction with this idea before he and the King of Portugal fall into distrust with each other, and we see shortly after that he's never to be heard from again. The speculation is that he was actually caught, and he was actually for sure arrested. We know he was arrested, and he was put to death. quite possibly. He comes onto the scene in 1525, and then by the year 1535, we don't hear from him anymore. Now, another figure from this time is a convert to Judaism, probably himself a descendant of conversos, and his name is Shlomo Molcho, who actually is inspired by Haruvaini, and he's a descendant of conversos. He converts back to Judaism and becomes a Torah scholar, becomes an inspiring figure, and unfortunately he is eventually arrested by the not so holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and he's put to death. But again, this is to show that these sort of messianic ideas, the talk of Messiah, the talk of the Jews returning to Israel, is often gets a rebirth after tragedies in the Jewish world. Okay, so two of the main places that Jews go to and are able to actually settle in after the expulsion from Spain and the expulsion from Western Europe after the tumultuous times of the 14th century, the 15th century, the two main places are Israel and Poland. Now, Israel gets notice or honorable mention, I'll say, because it's Israel, because it's Eretz Yisrael, and if we would look back at the let's refer to our modern sojourn in Israel, where the majority of the world Jewish population is in Israel. Let's refer to that as the Third Commonwealth. So at what point does the Third Commonwealth begin? Does it begin in 1948 with the modern state of Israel? Does it begin with what we call the first Aliyah, which we'll talk about in a number of sessions from now, in the mid-19th century? Does it begin with the students of the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon making their way to the land of Israel in the 18th century? At what point do we say the population of the Jews of Israel begins? I would say that it begins when Saladin conquers Jerusalem and invites the Jews back. The Ramban is one of the first prominent Jews to go back. And it's a trickle from that point. That's the 1200s. It's a trickle through the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s. Again, it's still pretty rough in Israel with all the Crusades, but we're going to see that after the Jews are expelled from Spain, that a lot of Sephardic Jewry and other Ashkenazi Jews are going to follow along, are going to go to the land of Israel. Now, one of the early prominent Jews, after the Ramban, of course, but during this time period, to make their way back to the land of Israel, is a Jew by the name of Rav Yaakov Beirav, the Rebbe Rav we refer to him as, and he's an exile from Spain. He was born in Spain, left in 1492. His family goes to Morocco. Now, in Morocco, the Jewish community was being rebuilt at this time by Sephardic Jewry, and he's recognized as a Torah scholar of note, and they actually make him the rabbi in the communities of North Africa, probably at the young age of 18. But eventually his family goes to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem at this time is still this is the early 1500s. It is very hard for Jews to live there, so he makes his way up to Tzfas. Now, what's interesting is Tzfas at this time period in the 16th century is the largest community in Eretz Yisrael. Now, you might say Tzfas, like, it's so off the beaten path. For anyone who's been there, it's up in the Galilee. It's up on the top of a mountain. If you've ever been there in the winter, it's very cold. And, if you're ever there in summer, it's very hot. But that's many places in Eretz Yisrael. And how did Tzfat become such a community? So it's interesting that Tzfat becomes it's probably not even mentioned Tanakh. It's not really mentioned in the Talmud. It's not mentioned a lot in Judaism. The Crusaders actually are probably the first people to actually settle Tzfas in a major way. And but as the Muslims take over in Eretz Yisrael, they make Tzfas a major community. So as Jews start to make their way to Tzfat, back to Eretz Yisrael, they mainly go to Tzfat, and there's already a thriving Muslim community there. And it's the land of Israel is under Ottoman control right now, and the Ottomans for the most part welcome the Jews. Suleiman the Magnificent, the big Ottoman leader, they for the most part welcome the Jews to Eretz Yisrael. And therefore it's interesting because from the 16th century, Really until modern times, really until the War of Independence, the Jews and the Muslims in Tzfat will live harmoniously. And it'll be a split city for most of that time period. We're going to see that when the Rebbe Rav comes to Tzfat, there's maybe a handful of families there. By the middle of the 16th century, there's 1,000 Jewish families there. And there's 1,000 Muslim families there. And that balance really of 50-50 at Tzfat will be the case until 1948, when the Jewish community, there will be a siege laid upon them by the Muslims, and the great story of the Davidka, where all the Muslims will go away, and the Muslims will never return. Tzfat is now just a 100% Jewish city. There's no Muslim quarter of Tzfat, but this is when it starts. And Tzfat is actually considered one of the holy cities of Israel. We refer to Israel as having 4 holy cities. The 4 holy cities are Jerusalem, obviously Yerushalayim, the capital, Hebron, because that's where our patriarchs are buried. That's where the Maris HaMachpelah is. Tiberias, and Tiberias is on the list basically because that was the last presence of the Jews in Israel at the time of the Second Commonwealth, meaning long after the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem, the Jews flocked north, and Tiberias is really the capital of that community. It's where the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, is written, and there's a concept of that the final redemption of the Jewish people, when the Mashiach comes, it'll start in the same place where the Jews were last, which is in the north of Israel, and Tzfat. And Tzfat is the last to make it on the list, and it's because of this time period. And it's because of who lived there. It's because of who came there. And the first major personality is Rav Yaakov Rav. Now, we can ask the question, why Tzfat? Beyond the fact that there are already Muslims there and there's a population there, but really, why did Tzfat become a Jewish community? And one of the reasons is probably because what I just told you, or linked to that at least, that maybe it's its proximity to Tiberias, but it was a little safer than Tiberias, because Tiberias is a coastal town, it's in the plains, and Tzfat is on a mountain, so it's a little bit safer. Another opinion is because throughout the Galilee and the area of Tzfat is where many of the great Kabbalistic scholars are buried. Mount Meron is in suburban Tzfat. It's one mountain over from Tzfat, and that is where Rav Shimon Bar Yochai is buried. That's where Hillel HaZaken, the great Hillel, is buried. And throughout the Galilee, throughout that area, with many great scholars. Rav Pinchas ben Yair from the Talmud is buried in Tzfat, and that's one thought, that these scholars who have as we'll see, have a bent towards mysticism, want to be in that place where many mystical scholars are buried. Okay, so be it as it may, that's Tzfat is really the capital of, or at least the largest population center of Israel in the 16th century. Now, with this beginning of the first time since the destruction of the temple and since the Jews were finally completely kicked out of Israel in the 4th century of the Common Era, that we have we start to see the population numbers going in the right direction. We have roughly 1,000 Jewish families in Tzfat, which 1,000 families is 5,000 people roughly. We have at least a notable Jewish community in Jerusalem at this time, and Rav Yaakov Rav, who's considered the leading scholar in Tzfat, has an idea. He says, okay, the Jews are on the way back to Israel. It's time to reconstitute the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin ceased to exist when the Jews left Israel in the 4th century. It's unclear why, because technically we probably could have had a Sanhedrin in exile. But be it as it may, that he says, okay, from roughly 350 until now, mid-1500s, for the past 1,200 years, there hasn't been a strong Jewish presence in Israel. Now there is, so we need a Sanhedrin. Now, there was a technical problem that the Rebbe Rav had in reconstituting the Sanhedrin. And that is, the Sanhedrin is, of course, the high Jewish court, the highest Jewish court of all time. And to be a member of the Sanhedrin, a scholar has to have a special type of smicha, of rabbinical ordination, and that is, it has to be a smicha that is linked back to Moshe, that is linked back to Moses. In other words, that I got smicha from a rabbi, who got it 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 from Moshe himself. And therefore, when the Sanhedrin was disbanded in the 4th century, from Moshe until that point, every member of all of these 70 members of the Sanhedrin had, or 73 members of the Sanhedrin had that smicha linking back to Moshe. Now, that smicha ceased to exist for these 1,200 years while the Sanhedrin was non-existent. So it's a great idea. The Rebbe Rav wants to reconstitute the Sanhedrin, but how's he going to do it without the smicha from Moshe? So the general Jewish approach at this time was that, when the Mashiach comes, when the Messianic era comes, he'll figure it out, right? He'll have enough to figure out with bringing us back to the land of Israel, with rebuilding the temple. He can also figure out how to reconstitute the Sanhedrin. That's one approach. Another approach is the concept of Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, that will happen at the same time. And I mean, other opinions say it'll happen a lot later, and it won't happen at the same time when the Messiah is on the planet. It won't happen until 1,000 years later. But there are opinions that it'll happen at the same time, and therefore Moshe himself will be there in the Messianic era through the resurrection of the dead, and he'll be able to give his smicha. Whatever the reason is, those are sort of the predominant Jewish opinions. But the Rambam, Maimonides, has a unique opinion. He says, now the Rambam always, is a great rationalist. He never likes miraculous ideas or concepts and avoids quoting them at all costs. So the Rambam says that you can reconstitute the smicha of Moshe by having the majority of the wise men of Israel confer smicha onto one person. That smicha will then have the status of the smicha, the rabbinical ordination from Moshe, and he will in turn around and give it to 72 others, and you will have a Sanhedrin. So the Rebbe Rav was Sephardi, the Rambam was the Rambam, and he went with this idea. So he conveyed smicha on. They had a meeting. Of many great scholars in 1538, and he conveyed smicha on a number of them. They agreed to give him the smicha of the Rambam spoke about, the smicha Moshe, and he turned around and gave it to a number of others, and with the goal of forming a Sanhedrin. And actually, he formed a Sanhedrin. Now, some of the other notables that he gave the smicha to were Rav Yosef Cairo, Rav Moshe Alshich, Rav Moshe Cordovero, and Rav Yaakov ibn Chaviv. Now, Rav Levi ibn Chaviv, now known as the Ralbach. Now, who was Rav Levi ibn Chaviv? Rav Levi ibn Chaviv was the Rav of Yerushalayim, the Rav of Jerusalem. Now, he gets the smicha via letter. He wasn't in the meeting, and he didn't accept it. And not only that, he opposed the idea. Because he said, I'm not sure that the halacha would be like the Rambam, and even if the Rambam is correct, I'm not sure if this is the right time, and I don't think we're the right people. So he rejected the smicha of the Rebbe Rav, and he rejected being a part of the Sanhedrin, and he rejected the concept of the Sanhedrin. So you have this struggle develop between Tzfat, which is the size-wise is the population center of the Jewish community in Israel at that time, but Jerusalem is Jerusalem, and the community of Jerusalem opposes the idea. The community of Tzfat is in favor of the idea. Virtually all of the rabbis outside of the land of Israel are against the idea, but the Rebbe Rav's approach is they didn't have a voice because they weren't in the land of Israel. And even though the Rebbe Rav, so to speak, put this plan into motion, he also realized that if the public doesn't accept it, it'll be worthless, because there was, it could be great that he developed a Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, in Tzfat, and if no one respects it as the Sanhedrin, it ain't a Sanhedrin. We're going to see when we get to Napoleon. The Napoleon establishes a Sanhedrin. Now again, he borrows the name, he's not trying to establish our Jewish Sanhedrin, but anyone can establish a Sanhedrin, but if the Jewish people don't accept it, it ain't a Sanhedrin. So the Rebbe Rav realized that, and therefore the idea, so to speak, dies with him. Now, this was the boldest attempt that we are going to have until modern times, because while there's going to be a discussion of it when the modern state of Israel is founded in 1948, it'll die very quickly. It won't gain much traction. Not nearly as much traction as it did in the time of the Rebbe Rav. But the idea dies with the Rebbe Rav, the smicha dies there, and that is really the end of the concept of the Sanhedrin. Now, as we mentioned before, one of the students of the Rebbe Rav and one of the recipients of his smicha was Rav Yosef Cairo. Rav Yosef Cairo was born in Toledo, Spain, was in exile from Spanish Jewry, went to Portugal, was in exile from Portugal, went to Italy, exiled from Italy, went to Greece, Turkey. The family was all over the place. Eventually, he makes his way to Tzfas. And he is he comes under the influence of the Rebbe Rav. And is really, Tzfas just becomes a powerhouse of scholars at this time. We've already discussed the Rebbe Rav. We mentioned already the names of Moshe Cordovero, the Alshech, who both wrote tremendous writings of Kabbalistic works. The Moshe Cordovero wrote the Tomer Devora. The Alshech wrote a book that we refer to as the Alshech. And now we have Rav Yosef Cairo. Now, Rav Yosef Cairo had three major works, and if you take just one of them, it's a monumental magnum opus. His first major work was called the Kesef Mishnah. Now, the Kesef Mishnah was a commentary on the Rambam, because as we mentioned before, one of the I guess occupational hazards, one of the, I can call it a mistake, but one of the things about the Rambam's great work, the Mishnah Torah, is he didn't write sources. He just wrote what his opinion was as the halacha, and didn't write where it came from. The Kesef Mishnah comes in, written by Rav Yosef Cairo at this time, to write that commentary, to put in the sources, to defend the sources, and to show where Maimonides comes from. And while there's many commentaries on the Rambam, the Kesef Mishnah is like the main commentary on the Rambam. The next major work that he writes is a commentary on the Tur, on the Arbitorium, which we talked about last time, he calls it after his own name, the Beis Yosef. He was Rav Yosef Cairo. He calls the book the Beis Yosef, the House of Joseph. And this is a book that he said it took him 25 years to write. Now the Tur was at this point, it was an Ashkenazi codification of Jewish law, or codification to a certain extent, really bringing in all of the opinions, but really the bottom line was usually the Ashkenazi opinion. And by writing the Beis Yosef, he was Sephardi. He was writing a Sephardi commentary on the Tur. And that is the main commentary on the Tur until this day. In fact, when the modern day approach to smicha learning, as we learn the Shulchan Aruch, is that we always start with, after the Talmud and the commentaries of the Talmud, we study the Tur and we study the Beis Yosef. Those are the two main commentaries we study, the Tur with the Beis Yosef commentary. And that Beis Yosef has everything in it. After the failed attempt of his Rebbe, the Rebbe Rav, to found a Sanhedrin, the Rav Yosef Cairo says, okay, so we're not going to have a living Sanhedrin at this point, so I'm going to make a written Sanhedrin. And at that point, he writes the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch means the arranged table, the organized table, and that becomes the code of Jewish law until this day. 500 years plus later, it is still the code of Jewish law. Now, in that book, he follows the structure of the Torah from Rav Yaakov ben Asher, as he has the same four sections, the same chapters that the Torah has, and he essentially summarizes what he had written in the Beis Yosef, and his Beis Yosef commentary on the Torah. And in that, he codifies it, he makes it simple, he makes it clear how to look up the laws, how to read the laws. It's short, clear, concise, and he writes his introduction that when he had to make a halachic decision as to what to write as the final word of the Shulchan Aruch, he had his virtual Beis Din, if you will, his virtual Jewish court, made up of Rav Yitzchak Elfasi, the Rif, who we mentioned before, 11th century Sephardic rabbi, who wrote a commentary on the Talmud that just gave us the bottom halachic line of the Talmud. We had the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, the Ashkenazi rabbi, the father of the Tur, we said one was the Ashkenazi rabbis who saved Ashkenazi Jewry after the burning of the Talmud by Louis IX, and then of course the Rambam. And now it's interesting because he was Sephardi; it was 2-1 Sephardim against Ashkenazim, and that's why the Sephardic the Shulchan Aruch is looked at as a book that has the Sephardic approach. The Sephardic approach to customs, to halachos, was published in 1542. Now, we're going to discuss in a moment Polish Jewry, and we're going to see that something happens in Poland to ensure that the Shulchan Aruch will be the code of Jewish law, not just in the Sephardic world, because at this point the Sephardic world is very small, and from really this point forward in Jewish history, the Sephardic world is going to remain very small. But there will be something that will happen in Poland, as we'll discuss now, that will make it that the Shulchan Aruch will be the undisputed code of Jewish law, basically for eternity. Okay, so as we jump now to Poland, Poland, it was a very interesting place for the Jews because you look at it, finally the Jews got to migrate somewhere. They make their way to Eastern Europe. Now, Jews probably came to Eastern Europe already very early on, or much before this. We already discussed the Khazars before, who were in the Caucasus. They were Jewish, and they were in modern day Georgia, modern day Kazakhstan. And so you had small Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, but with the expulsion of the Jews from Western Europe, Eastern Europe becomes the place, and most notably Poland. Poland, for whatever place, we don't think of it today as such a liberal place, or at least maybe now, but not previously. It was communist, and then it was Nazi rule and whatnot, in a place of tremendous Jewish oppression. But before that, from this time period, from the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, we see it's actually a quite hospitable place to the Jews. And in fact, Jews make a play on words of the word Poland, and they say it's Polin, which in Hebrew means here we will rest. In other words, like here we will rest out the exile. Now, even though Poland is somewhat hospitable to the Jews, and we'll see the Jews will promulgate throughout all of Eastern Europe, throughout the other Russian countries, former Soviet Union countries, we think it's all Anatevka. We're like in Anatevka and Fiddle on the Roof, everything was great and dandy until the Jews were kicked out. It was a pretty rough life in Eastern Europe on any day of the week. Even though we had a certain amount of acceptance in Poland and these places, Poland, Lithuania, White Russia, and Ukraine, which was all part of the Polish kingdom at that time. We would not really consider it hospitable nowadays. It was not a great situation for the Jews in this area. But what's interesting is, even though there's a lot of anti-Semitism, and the anti-Semitism we'll talk about how we'll pretty soon, once we get to the 17th century, major pogroms will start up. But to a certain extent, the Jews will keep to themselves, unlike in Spain and even some of the Western European Jewish experiences we had. The Jews have no desire to be like a Polish peasant, right? They have no desire to be like their non-Jewish neighbors. So that's going to make it that the Jewish community is going to be very insular within the greater Polish kingdom. And in this area, we're going to see Judaism really thrive. In these small insular communities, Judaism will thrive. Torah scholarship will thrive. The great idea of the European yeshiva, the Lithuanian yeshiva, will be developed in these insular communities. And not only that, but the Jews had a certain amount of sovereignty even within the Polish kingdom. There was a governing body of the Jewish community known as the Vad Arba Aratzos, the Council of the Four Lands, that represented the four major areas of Poland: Greater Poland, Lesser Poland, Galicia, and the last area was known as Volhynia, and this was just all of modern-day Poland and Ukraine, basically. Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania. What we now call Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus was the Polish Empire at that time. So the Jews had a certain amount of sovereignty and provincial powers with this Vad Arba Aratzos, with this Council of Four Lands. And so this is where the Jews see they're going to kind of wait it out. And in truth, even though we had a much better life and many times in Western Europe, we're going to survive in Poland for a good, until Hitler, basically. We're going to be able to make it work in much of this area, this Polish Empire. Now, at this time period, when you have Rav Yosef Cairo writing the Shulchan Aruch in Tzfat in Israel, you have the chief rabbi, or the leader of Polish Jewry, is a rabbi by the name of Rav Moshe Isserlis. Now, Rav Moshe Isserlis lived in the town of Krakow, and he will die very young. Legends are he was either 33 or 43 when he passed away, but no one says he's older than 43. So he's obviously a young prodigy, becomes a scholar at a young age, and becomes a rabbi, the leader in a young age. He actually will pass away on Lag BaOmer, so his yahrzeit is Lag BaOmer, coming up soon. That's the day my daughter, God willing, is getting married. And he's the unequivocal leader of Polish Jewry. Now, he and his place in Poland, in Krakow, was also working on a code of Jewish law. But he was a little bit younger than Rav Yosef Cairo, and he had actually had correspondences with Rav Yosef Cairo, and he finds out about the Shulchan Aruch, and he actually gets a copy of the Shulchan Aruch, because remember, this is after the modern printing press is already producing books, so the Shulchan Aruch is whipped out by the printing press, and it makes its way to Poland, it makes its way to Krakow, and Rav Yosef and Rav Moshe Isserlis gets a copy of the Shulchan Aruch, and he says, I don't need to write a code of law, because this is the code of law, this is it. He's so impressed with the work that he says this is the unequivocal code of law for the Jewish people. But there was one issue. That since Rav Yosef Karo was Sephardi, the customs mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch were the Sephardic customs. So Rav Yosef Karo, so Moshe Isserles made a decision in deciding, number one, not to write his own code of law, but instead to write a work that he called the Mappa. Now, Mappa means a tablecloth. Shulchan Aruch meant the arranged table, Mappa is the tablecloth. Instead of writing his own work for Ashkenazi Jewry, who had the numbers at this time, he writes a commentary on Rav Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch, and it's written as glosses. In fact, when you look at it, the Shulchan Aruch, it'll have the words of the Mechaber, which is the name we give to Rav Yosef Karo, and then it has the words of the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, Reish Mem Aleph, Rav Moshe Isserles. And those always start with the word Haggah, which means like gloss or editing on the words, and then it has the words of the Ramah. And from that time period that he wrote the Mappa, there's never been a Shulchan Aruch, to the best of my knowledge, printed without the two together, making it a unified work for the Jewish people. You know, so often as Jews we're factioned. We have different factions, and we have inner fighting, and 2 Jews, 25 opinions. But here there's a work of Shalom by Rav Moshe Isserles, writing his commentary as glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, making it that the Shulchan Aruch would be the unequivocal, undisputed, until this day, code of Jewish law. And not only that, but it would sort of bring a certain amount of unity of scholarship together. Because now the Ashkenazim would be exposed to the Sephardic ideas, the Sephardim are exposed to the Ashkenazi ideas, and we're all a lot closer because of how the Shulchan Aruch is written. So that's a monumental feat of unity that is made until this day, that today when we look in the Shulchan Aruch, the words of Yosef Karo are in boldface, the words of Rav Moshe Isserles are in a lighter font, but it's one work to basically unite the Jewish people. And when you go to Krakow today, there's a shul that's referred to as the Ramaz Shul, which presumably is the synagogue he davened in. There's the old cemetery of Krakow where he is buried, and on his tombstone it says Memoshe ad Moshe lo kam kemoshe, which means from Moses until Moses no one arose like Moses, which is also, as we mentioned, written on Maimonides' tombstone. And the idea was probably they were saying from Maimonides until this point, not that they were saying because when it was written on Maimonides' tombstone, it was a way of saying from Moshe Rabbeinu till the Rambam there was no one else like the Rambam, and now they wrote on his tombstone, on the Ramah's tombstone, from the Rambam until Rav Moshe Isserles 400 years later, there was no one else like him. So definitely in scholarship that was the case, but also in the fact they made this monumental step for the unity of Jewish scholarship and for the unity of Judaism. God willing, next week we will. Even though it's Pesach, it'll be Chol Moed Pesach, I'm still planning on giving a lecture, and we will continue back to Tzfat, and we'll discuss the rise of modern day Kabbalah, of Lurianic Kabbalah, of Yitzchak Luria, the Arizal, and that development and that revolution that took place also at this time. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening. Have a Chag Kodesh v'Sameach, and I look forward to talking to you more next week.